Hi, Misha here, and as I said last time when we talked about the Nagato class, this time, we're going to talk about Musashi. And I've already done a video on on Yamato. So, yeah, that one I used a 1/700 scale model from Forces of Valor. And in this one, we're just going to talk about Musashi mostly, which is the 1/1100 scale diecast from Eaglemoss. I did bring out, though, a 1/250 scale from Atlas Editions, and this is of Yamato. Eaglemoss does make a Yamato, but they're not available, and I actually just was lucky to get Musashi, so not a whole lot of difference in the two ships. Most of their differences were internal. So as you know, these are the largest battleships ever made, and they had the largest naval guns ever put on a ship. So, where did it begin? Well, while Japan had modernized, updated, rebuilt a lot of ships in the 20s and 30s, the Congos and the Issei's and so what, they actually hadn't built a battleship since Mutsu. Part of it was their treaty commitments, part of it was just other things. But in the 1930s, nationalists took power and took influence over the emperor. And so in 1934, they essentially walked out of the League of Nations, and quickly they would renounce their treaty obligations. And anyway, the first London Naval Treaty was due to expire at the end of 1936, and Japan never signed the second one. So between 1934 and 1936, they studied 24 or more battleship design concepts, looking at guns between 16 and 18 inches, all kinds of different things. And then finally, in July of 1936, they narrowed it down to a couple of very similar finalists, and then after tweaking the designs a bit, they settled upon one in March of 1937. It was to have 9 18.1 inch guns. It was to have a secondary battery of 6.1 inch guns, and many other guns besides for anti-aircraft and dual purpose. It was to be 65,000 tons standard and 70,000 tons full load. Planned to be 27 knots. It would carry aircraft with a couple of catapults, and it would be the biggest bestest ever because Japan was up against America. America could outproduce Japan, and they knew this. So the only way they thought they could win was to have a battleship that could take on multiple enemy ships at once. Also, they believed that they could win a war with America by winning one big decisive battle. Just knocking them out, making it too much of a headache. Kind of like they'd done with Russia. So that was the concept behind it all. What they were hoping for. To that end, the government quickly ordered 5 of the new class. And construction would begin in absolute secrecy. And amazingly, they were able to maintain it. In fact, the U.S. knew virtually nothing about this class, even into 1942. So what exactly do we have? Of course, the big thing about the Yamatos were the guns. 18.1 inches, 9 of them, super firing forward turret. This shell was over 3,200 pounds. and it could fire about 1 to 2 a minute at a range out to 26 miles. And the secondary battery was nothing to sneeze at either. It had 4 triple turrets of 6.1 inch caliber guns. As I said, these are originally on the Magamis, but were quickly taken off when they put 8-inch guns on those cruisers, and they would end up on Yamato and Musashi, as well as on Oyoto, the cruiser. So waste not, want not. It had 5-inch guns, it had 13mm machine guns, it had 25mm anti-aircraft, it had a lot of stuff. And it could carry up to 7 float planes for reconnaissance, and it had a crane and catapult for them. Originally they were hoping to have a ship up to 33 knots, but they kind of dropped this for other reasons. So yeah, the max speed was 27 knots. And they had a maximum weight of about 72,000 tons. Both Musashi and Yamato were ordered in March of 1937. Yamato was laid down that November, and Musashi was laid down the following March in 1938. And of course it would take them some time to build them. They would each launch in 1940, first in August for Yamato and then in November for Musashi, but then they had to be fitted out, and so it took quite a bit of time. And actually Musashi was delayed a little bit because she'd been designed with more facilities for use as a flagship for admirals and other high-ranking officials, and they made a few last-minute changes to her design. So while Yamato was first operational, at least declared fully operational, in May of 1942, although she'd been commissioned a little before, Musashi wasn't commissioned until August of 1942. And then in September, she would get her first radar, and she would start practicing and finish fitting out that September, October, November. Really, she would spend the rest of 1942 just working out the bugs and training and doing things of that nature. So she was really too late in the year to get involved in most of the campaigns, including like Guadalcanal. But in January of 1943, Admiral Yamamoto transferred his flag from Yamato and would take command of Musashi. Once Musashi was felt to be ready to go, it was made official on February 11th. She became the new flagship of the combined fleet, and again, she had better facilities than Yamato for this duty. It's worth pointing out that when she first was commissioned, she had a crew of around 2,500, but when she operated as a flagship, they would jump up to 2,700, and then later in the war, even 2,800 officers and men. She basically would just kind of bounce around a bit, and then in April, Admiral Yamamoto would leave for other operations. This would be when his Betty bomber was intercepted and shot down by Americans. And so throughout April and May, Musashi would transport his ashes, his urn, in his cabin, eventually returning it to Japan when they would get back to, I think it was Yakuzuso, the naval port there. She docked in June. She was to have more radars installed. She had surface search radars installed, and also the Emperor visited the ship in a big delegation. And then after this minor refit and upgrade to her air defenses was complete, she would sail out. She would visit Truk. She would sortie a few times that fall looking for Allied aircraft carriers and other ships, but not really much is happening, honestly. In February, she would dock again at Truk, and she would take on board a division of Japanese Army soldiers, as well as a division of the Navy's Special Landing Forces. And she would leave on the 24th to transport them to Palau. And she would do so successfully, getting there at the end of the month. And she would kind of hang out until March there. But on March 29th, the Japanese were informed that Palau was about to receive a Allied air raid. So, to get out of Dodge, Musashi left port again. But it was kind of an instance of out of the frying pan and into the fire in a way. Leaving port to avoid bombs from an air raid, she ran smack dab in to a prowling submarine who promptly launched 6 torpedoes at her. Now, she did evade 5 of them, but not 6. One hit, made nearly a 20-foot hole in her side, and killed 7 crew, wounded others, and she took on not an insignificant amount of water. Therefore, in April, she went back to port at Kure to have the damage fixed and to undergo another refit. They would install slightly better radar. Radars weren't really that great, especially compared to Americans of the 1944, but she did get better radar. They would also remove her 2 side turrets, or wing turrets, for the secondary guns. So she would go down from a total of 12 6.1-inch guns to 6. And in the 2 side turrets' place, they would install additional triple anti-aircraft mounts. At this point, she would have 130 25mm guns, plus still some 5-inch and 13mm machine guns. Again, I don't know where Japan got so many 25mm cannons. Seems like they were running out of everything else except those. Either way, she's bristling now. And then she leaves port and joins up with Yamato. They both are at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, and they both escort Japanese carriers, but really don't see much of any action. And then in July, both are again assigned to be used as troop transports. That's a great way to use your flashy battleship, isn't it? But I mean, needs must, right? So yeah, they transport troops in July. And then August, September, they prepare for the counter-invasion against Allied actions to retake the Philippines, which of course resulted in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And so they were going to be part of the center force, driving in, trying to drive off American ships. And so Musashi would leave on October 22nd. While transiting the Sibuyan Sea on the morning of October 24th, reconnaissance planes from Intrepid spotted Musashi. And it wasn't long, just before 10:30 that morning, that the first relatively small wave of bombers came at her. They would hit her with one bomb that wouldn't do much, but one other bomb would actually penetrate and do some damage. Although Musashi would take 2 planes out of the sky. The second wave came around noon, and again a couple of bomb hits, some damage, nothing too bad with the bombs, and she would take 2 more planes out of the sky with her guns. At this point she is using special rounds in her main guns that were built for anti-aircraft purposes, so they're not completely useless. But the first real big blow against her came when 3 torpedoes all hit on the port side. If it had been 2 and 1 or whatever, port and starboard, but because they all hit on one side, it made counter flooding more difficult, although they did manage it. But by this point, her speed is down to about 22 knots, and she's taking on water, starting to go down a little bit in the water. The third wave came about 1:30. Now more carriers are joining in, Lexington and Essex. And after a few more hits, her speed's now down to 20 knots. And she's down at about 6 foot at the bow. And they've kept her list relatively stable thanks to flooding and counter flooding and all that, but it's starting to get a little more difficult. But if you've seen my video on Yamato or just know the history, these ships are tough as nails to really put out of action. And so even after 3 successive waves, Musashi is still very much fighting and not in any danger of sinking as the afternoon wears on. A 4th wave of attacks would be launched by the USS Enterprise, and by the time they showed up, Musashi was nearly 13 feet down at the bow, but still fighting. And the bombers from Enterprise were bringing some heavier artillery. They've been mostly trying with 500-pound bombs. These had 1,000-pound armor-piercing, armor-penetrating bombs, plus more torpedoes, of course. And 4 of these heavy bombs hit her, along with 3 more torpedoes. Now things are getting a little bad. Speed drops to 13 knots. More flooding, counter flooding, and then around 3:30, a 5th wave comes in. Intrepid has launched more. She's been joined by the USS Franklin, and now she's, because of the slower speed, really gonna take a pounding. She gets hit by a lot more bombs and torpedoes at this point. And when this next wave disengages, she's down to 6 knots. She's nearly a submarine. She's so underwater at her bow. And she's temporarily lost steering. Her rudder's temporarily jammed. Engines are still sort of going at this point at 3:30, 4 o'clock. But she's in a bad way. However, I will say, she's still fighting. She shot down another 6 enemy aircraft. So, still putting up a fight. And you have to give credit where credit is due there. However, it's starting to look pretty desperate. And the battle is not going well for the Japanese on other fronts too. So, the admiral in charge kind of leaves Musashi to her fate. And her crew fight desperately to keep her afloat. What they're hoping to do is find a place to beach her so she won't sink, and then they can effect repairs and hopefully tow her back somewhere where she can be revived. So it's still not a foregone conclusion, at least not 100%, that she's going under yet. As the afternoon rolls on, she's still fighting to stay afloat at about 4:30, at which time the admiral in charge does assign a heavy cruiser and a couple of destroyers to assist her, maybe tow her, do what they can to escort her. They're still trying to beach her, but she's got a 10-degree list, and she's as much as 26 feet under at the bow. She's taken 17 bomb hits and as many as 19 torpedo hits at this point. Yeah, of course, a massive amount of flooding. But she's steaming on. She fights through about 5 o'clock. They're really trying to beach her. But then her engine rooms, the remaining ones, flood and her engines die. And without engine power, there's virtually no hope. The crew fights for another couple of hours, but by around 7 o'clock, the list is getting worse and worse. It goes way past 10, and finally the order to abandon ship is given. It gets up to about a 30-degree list and then just capsizes and goes under. Of her crew, of around 2,700 at this time, about half are rescued. What's funny is she had actually taken on board earlier some crew from an already sunk ship. So they're, from one ship to another. And so, yeah, Musashi is lost. The flagship of the combined fleet is lost at the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Yamato does survive to fight on. She goes back to Japan. But her days are not very long either. She is sunk on April 7th during basically a suicide mission to try to repulse the Allied landings at Okinawa. And that's the end of her. Again, I've done a full video on Yamato, so I'm not neglecting her. I just haven't really talked about Musashi much. As I said, they ordered 5 of these ships. So what happened to the others? Well, in 1940, they did lay down Shinano, the 3rd member. But before construction was all that far along, the decision was made after the Battle of Midway in 1942 to convert her into an aircraft carrier. Now, from the beginning, there were those in the Japanese Navy that thought building the Yamatos was a mistake and that they should put more money and time into carriers. So with Shinano, they got their wish, and she was actually completed. She launched, completed. She was even technically commissioned in right after, honestly, the Musashi went down. And she was going to finish out her fitting out and take on planes. 10 days after she left port, she was spotted by an American submarine and torpedoed. And because she had a skeleton crew and a new crew, they did not really have the proficiency of damage control that Musashi's crew had. And so Shinano sunk, a week and a half after she was commissioned, left dock, however you'd like to say it. The 4th ship in the class, which was never named, was laid down, but it never got that far and was scrapped. And the 5th ship was only on paper, never even laid down. So, they actually, at least started 4 out of the 5. And with these, neither ship did much in World War II except consume a lot of resources, including fuel and men. the era of the battleship was over effectively. America had the Iowas, of course, but even they didn't do a heck of a lot, and I think the only reason that Britain finished up Vanguard was because it was just easier to finish it than not. But World War II was the war that really switched from battleships to carriers. So we definitely see that with Musashi and Yamato. I mean, they were well-designed ships in the sense that they were tough and rugged. No Bismarck here. And they had very powerful guns, and they had very competent crews, but for one thing, Japan was too reluctant to use them. And for another, originally they wanted to have that one big decisive battle and push America out of the Pacific. That never happened. So, the fate was already sealed. Admiral Yamamoto knew if Japan could not win or at least have a peace agreement with America within about 6 months, maybe a year on the outside, Japan would lose. Because America had 32% of the world's production capability in the 1930s, and even more in the 1940s. Compare that to Japan, who had about 3.5% of the production capability of the entire world. The U.S. could literally outbuild Japan 10-1. And, with the Essex class carriers, pretty much did just that. Anyway, since I had addressed Yamato, I thought it's only fair to address Musashi, since I do have the Eaglemoss model. It's also interesting to see just how the 1/1100 scale allows more than the 1/250 scale. You wouldn't think that would be a huge difference, but it's just that little bit much more that allows for detail. And it's not that the Atlas and also the De Agostini, which are pretty much the same, are bad, but the Eaglemoss just seem to be that little bit higher tier. Alrighty, well now we're through all of the Japanese battleships. Any questions or comments, please do post them. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon. Next time.